Live. So all right, I think we are officially live. Hi, I want to welcome everybody to this latest installment of our Rev War Revelry series. Tonight we have a very special guest coming with us here. This is David L. Preston. You might know him for his work, Braddock's Defeat, the Battle of the Monongahela, and the Road to Revolution. That is the work that we will be discussing tonight, all about Edward Braddock and the Battle of the Monongahela. Now, if you don't know David, he is an award-winning historian, and currently he serves as the General Mark W. Clark Distinguished Professor of History and is at the Citadel, and is also the director of the Citadel's online master's program in military history. Growing up in Western PA, it's nourished his passion, obviously, for colonial history. In his first book, The Texture of Contact, received multiple awards. In his 2015 study, Braddock's Defeat, the definitive work on the road to the Battle of the Monongahela and Braddock's ultimate defeat there. It's a fantastic book. If you haven't seen the cover, this is what we're talking about tonight. So David, always when we do these author interviews, I think a lot of the audience, and I know myself included, it's always interesting to learn how this topic actually came to you, because you don't accidentally write a book. You might accidentally stumble into a subject that intrigues you, but really when it came to you growing up around that history in Pennsylvania, what was really the moment in your life when you realized that, hey, you were going to write a book on Braddock's Defeat one day?
That's a great question. And before I answer that, just let me go ahead and say hello to the emerging Revolutionary War community out there. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you, and I've followed your group for many years with admiration, and I really have been looking forward to this evening. So first of all, thanks for tuning in. So I think I had, like most scholars, I kind of had an impression that Braddock's defeat was one of those things that was kind of done to death, that we knew all that there was to know about this expedition. And there certainly were and are a lot of great works out there. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of Paul Copperman's excellent book, Braddock at the Monongahela. I can remember purchasing that as a young kid at the National Park Service site there at Fort Necessity. And when I was researching my first book that dealt with the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy in the 18th century, I kept on thinking about a project that would look at the significance of Braddock's expedition. And what kind of drew me initially was the really amazing cast of characters that was present during this expedition and at the battle. You know, some of the most famous figures in early American history, to include George Washington, Thomas Gage, Charles Lee, Horatio Gates, Daniel Morgan, Daniel Boone. And I just thought that was a really neat coincidence that all these individuals were there. And I kind of started searching for, you know, I wonder if there are any like Native American participants or French Canadian officers that I could profile to kind of round out this group and kind of do like a group biography. Again, thinking that the expedition itself, the battle itself, there's nothing more to say there. So one of the things that kind of solidified it for me was realizing that a lot of these characters were present again at the siege of Boston at the beginning of the Revolutionary War in 1775 and 6. And I did find that Native American combatant in the course of my research for the first book, and his name was Adiadunhulungwa, and he was known to the Americans in the Revolution as Colonel Lewis or Lewis Cook. And he has a great story, by the way. He became a commissioned officer in the Continental Army. He was a Mohawk from Ganawage near Montreal. So I kind of had my collection of characters here. And so I proceeded initially with the group biography track. But during the course of my research, I kept on finding things about Braddock's expedition that were new. I started asking questions that previous scholars hadn't asked before. And as I was deeply interested in the French Canadian and the Native American side of things, I think that was probably the point where I realized that what I need to do is just write a straightforward narrative history of this really pivotal, epic moment in American history.
And what was the process like once you actually, got the ball rolling and started to write this work? What really sets it apart from prior works on the subject? You mentioned a lot of different kind of research, different kind of approaches to the subject that previous historians hadn't really taken. So tell us a little bit about some of those.
So, I think the big one is simply that previous scholars have always approached this from a kind of Anglo-centric viewpoint. They've only explored largely British sources. And of course, there are a few French sources that have been translated into English. But having done a lot of research in French language sources for my previous book, I knew that there was just a wealth of information on the 18th century in French sources that I didn't see previous scholars taking advantage of fully. No one had ever reconstructed what was happening on the French side, or certainly the Native American side of this whole campaign at all. And so I wanted to do more than just kind of have the French and the natives out there as kind of these foils to Braddock and the British. I wanted to find out what exactly the French were doing. And I would say that if I had to single out one discovery, I would say that it was the letter that I found at an archive in Caen in France, in Normandy. And it's a 1755 letter that provides for us the most detailed breakdown of what actually happened on the French side from the moment that their forces departed Fort Duquesne to the moment that they struck Braddock's column on July 9th, 1755. So that was kind of like the missing link in a way that allowed us to understand what the French were doing. And that letter in particular makes this much more a story about what the French and Indians did specifically to win the Battle of the Monongahela, vice what the British did to lose it, which is what previous scholars have always emphasized.
Right. And so finding this happened well over 250 years ago, 260 years ago now. How do you stumble upon a source like that everybody just seems to overlook? And when you actually say that you're searching archives in Normandy, are you actually there in person looking through these?
Yes, I did have a lead for that letter in an old 19th century catalog, and I was intrigued enough to want to go and find it. So it is. Striking gold like that is I think what historians dream of doing. And I guess the best way for me to put it is that I didn't know that I was struck by lightning at the time. I was reading through this document, and it reads in some respects like the same types of language as you see in other French documents from that period. And so as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, this sounds kind of familiar. But then as I kept on reading, I was like, wait, this is new, entirely new material here. I've never read this. And I guess my first instinct was to doubt myself. And so I typed some of, the keywords from the document just to see if they had been published elsewhere, or if some previous scholar had ever cited this before. And I think that was the moment that I realized that, wow, this is a real discovery here.
Were you feeling before that discovery, were you feeling all kind of down about your research because you weren't really finding anything substantial that would set you apart? And once you found that account, did that really, in your mind, did that tell you that, okay, this work is going to be well above the rest?
So, I mean, the document that I found there in Con, it certainly helped, but it really kind of solidified what I had done as far as research on the French side. Mm-hmm. I think, again, the decision point for me was seeing all of this new material, not just for the French side, for the British side as well. I knew that I would be able to say something new, even if I didn't have that letter. I mean, here's an example. One of the stories that I traced in the book, it's actually chapter 4 in the book. It's called Beaujo's Voyage, and it tracks the incredible odyssey of this French-Canadian officer, Captain Beaujo, the man who eventually defeats Braddock. It traces his 700-mile journey from Montreal down to Fort Duquesne in April, May, June, and July of 1755. No one had ever done that before. And to think about the incredible span that not just the French Canadians, but also many Native American nations, the journeys that they're making to assemble in the Ohio Valley in 1755. I mean, some of the Odawas from the Great Lakes region are coming close, to 1,000 miles to Fort Duquesne in the summer of 55. So it's really, an incredible story right there, and one that in some respects certainly rivals the more famous and well-known story of Braddock's march mm-hmm. across the Allegheny Mountains.
Yeah, definitely. So now you're talking about these approaches to the Ohio. Let's kind of get into the actual history now. So the Ohio River Valley, obviously, it's kind of the tinderbox of the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War as well. But what is so significant about the Ohio River Valley? What has happened there in the previous decades, even previous years before Braddock's march, that really will eventually turn it into an active war zone?
That's a great question, and very, very fundamental question too. Let's start with the French. The French have built a very dominant empire by the 1750s, and I would argue that the French are really in the driver's seat in the 1750s. Certainly, the British thought so. If you read some of the British accounts in newspapers and pamphlets from the early 1750s, they are very pessimistic about the future of British power in North America, and that's a reflection of just how great a degree that the French have dominated the interior of the continent, and how they have cornered through their effective diplomacy so many alliances with native nations. The French Empire in the 1750s, its strategic goal is containment of the British North American colonies, which they know are more numerous, more expansive. And in order to contain the British, rivers like the Ohio matter, because if the British are able to get a foothold in the interior on the Ohio, then of course they have access to the lower Ohio Valley, the Mississippi, but most importantly, they have a foothold in terms of the competition for trade and alliance with native peoples. So the French are mainly interested in the Ohio as a means of containing the British and preserving their own power thereby. For the British, they realize that, and conversely, that's why the Ohio is important, that if they can get a foothold there, it can not only begin to diminish or chip away at this French alliance system, but the British are also coming to trade and settle. And there's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy aspect to what the British are doing with they not only claim the interior by virtue of some of their colonial charters like Virginia's, but in the late 1740s, well-connected land developers, they form the Ohio Company of Virginia. They successfully receive an initial land grant from King George II for lands in what is today Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia. And they have to do certain things in order for these lands to become theirs, or for future lands to be open trade, establish trading posts, and also establish settlements. So all of these different competing factors, they begin to collide in the late 1740s, early 1750s. And the best way to say it is what the Board of Trade said in that time period. It was a document I was reading in the British archives, and even the British Board of Trade identified the Ohio Valley as, quote, a place of such national importance.
So obviously, if both sides are going to be kind of veering in the direction of the Ohio, one to expand, one to contain, it's inevitably going to lead to conflict, whether it's declared hostilities or undeclared hostilities, which is what we will see the latter in the first few years of the French and Indian War. So where are those first shots fired? And for those who may not know, this is their first time tuning in this part of history, who famously is involved in that event, and did he fire the first shot of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War?
So the ball really gets rolling in the year 1753, and the French, who have hitherto had a lot of, again, strategic dominance, the French Canadians are very proficient in terms of movements of forces, using these interior riverways, waterways, lakes, etc. And the French were desperate enough that they struck first. They took the initiative and started building fortifications. One right on Lake Erie, where modern day Erie, Pennsylvania sits. The other just about 16 miles to the south at one of the headwaters of the Allegheny River, or what the French called the beautiful river, La Belle Rivière. The British saw this fort building as a violation of British claims to the region, again, primarily Virginia's charter claims to that region. And so that was seen as a very aggressive move by the British. And the colony of Virginia took the lead in the diplomatic and then soon a military response to the French. And this is indeed where the young George Washington first comes onto the stage of history, first as a diplomat, as an emissary to the French near Lake Erie in 1753. But when the French politely rebuff him in 1753, the Virginians will send military forces to try to assert their claims and control over the lower Ohio Valley. All of this leads to, as you said, in some ways, this is almost, it's kind of reached a point of inevitability. Both sides are determined to, as Washington's instructions put it, to repel force with force. And this is where it gets a little tricky. Historians do like to identify Washington as the person who fired the first shots of the war. In May of 1754, Washington did indeed, with some of his native allies, orchestrate an ambush of a small French party led by a young French officer named Ensign Jumonville. And it is indeed the moment where there is like a skirmish. But one of the things that I hasten to point out in my book is that one of the things that had brought these French and British forces to this moment was the fact that the French had used force a month earlier. In April of 1754, they sent a massive flotilla of a few hundred men, including some of their regular Marine troops, with artillery, no less, to force the capitulation of a small British outpost seated right where Point State Park is in Pittsburgh today. Because the French were bringing such monumental force, no shots were fired. The British surrendered rather than be pulverized. But that type of aggression is certainly, you can understand from the British perspective, just that, an act of aggression, an act of war. And that is certainly how Washington perceived this changing geopolitical situation in May of 1754. And that's why he assumed that the French were coming with hostile intent and struck them. So that is indeed the moment, though, that the ball really gets rolling.
Yeah, and I know in your book, when you describe that event that takes place at present-day Pittsburgh and the small British force that's building this fortification is forced to leave, the reports that are really being distributed throughout the colonies are way overblown. I know Washington himself believed, you said that there was like 18 pieces of artillery or something that were brought in, and if siege lines were dug, this small garrison was going to be blown off of out of the forks of the Ohio itself.
Right.
And the thing that I always found fascinating is with that event at Jumonville Glen is Jumonville's party was a diplomatic party that was, going to ask the British to leave the area. Always said, well, they shouldn't have been fired on. Well, it's an ultimatum, though. What are the French supposed to do if Washington says, no, we're good, we're going to stay? Are they just supposed to go back and things are just going to go on peacefully? No. And again, we talk about the inevitability. Those first shots were going to happen.
Right. And I think that's an interesting question that one can ask in any time period in history. For those on the call who may have read David Hackett Fisher's book, Paul Revere's Ride, he especially engages that question in that book about, at what point do all of these contingencies in history, in the kind of build up to the Revolutionary War, at what point does this become kind of an inevitable thing?
Yeah.
And his answer in that book, I think, would be the same as mine here, is that the actors themselves are embracing inevitability. That's how they're perceiving the situation, which makes them drivers of all this in the end. Yeah,
and some of them, like Washington, almost hoping to be there when the first shot is fired, which he eventually was. So now, moving forward, when it comes to Braddock's march and Braddock's defeat, I think it's such a well-known and famous event in colonial history that it a lot of the times gets viewed as an isolated event. However, it was not. this was one of the largest offensives in 1755 that His Majesty's forces will take in North America against the French. And this is all without war actually being declared. So let's establish some context. It is not the only British advance in North America in 1755. What are the Crown's other objectives? What are they trying to accomplish before war could officially be declared?
Okay, this is a really key question that helps us to understand a lot about how the British government perceived North America and why they decided in the year 1755 to take a very significant action. You could make a case that Washington's shots fired in 1754 would not necessarily lead to what happened, a global conflict that's known as the 7 Years' War. The British government's response, however, in 1755 is really something that does help to make a broader conflict between Britain and France inevitable. So part of the British government's reaction here, this was a really cool thing to trace in my research. So news of Washington's skirmishes, and especially his defeat by the French at the Battle of Fort Necessity in July of 1754, that news reaches London in August. By September of 1755, in the space of about maybe 3 weeks, the British government has planned, like you said, Billy, not just one, but 4 different expeditions in North America aimed at kind of these key contested locations. So one of them was a British expedition in Nova Scotia to solidify British control there. Another one was aimed at Fort Niagara, in that crucial corridor. There was Braddock's expedition that was designed to depart from Virginia and then advance overland across the Appalachians. And then the other one, and I know a guy who wrote a book about this. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
The third and final one is that of William Johnson, aimed at a French outpost in the Champlain Valley called Crown Point. So this is extremely aggressive. As you said, this is a time of peace. There's no declared war yet. And here the British are, this is kind of like a preemptive strike, if you will. And it again suggests that the British government has accepted as kind of inevitable a state of war between Britain and France. And by accepting that, they've said, we're gonna get in there first and have a few fait accomplis before the French can respond.
Yeah, so I think in the British, their mind was, the French the previous year had shown of their strength in force against the British in the Ohio. So now the British were going to respond with an even larger show of force. But the French find out what is transpiring, that regulars are getting ready to deploy to ship to North America, and they'll respond themselves with sending regulars across the Atlantic Ocean.
Right.
So once again, the inevitability, it just keeps rolling.
Exactly. I mean, look at what's happening in the early phases of the war in Ukraine. I mean, it was almost like an arms race in a way that, Russia is funneling its forces into the Ukraine. The United States and its allies are funneling munitions and so on. It's that type of race mentality that's at work here. And there's another kind of forgotten incident that occurs on the high seas in 1755, where Royal Navy warships, again, in a time of peace, they attack and seize some of these French ships that are transporting French Army regulars across the Atlantic to Canada. And when they seized these French vessels, the Alcide and the Lee, they take some of these French regulars as prisoners.
And I think it's a young Captain Richard Howe, who's at the command of one of those Royal Navy ships, who actually orders the pursuit of those straggling ships that leads to the capture of those prisoners. So the man who is arriving now in North America, of course, to command all of His Majesty's forces on the continent is Edward Braddock. At this point, really in his career, kind of like his father, someone who has risen through the ranks, but really has not had that battlefield triumph under his name, or that experience gain, like a lot of other of his contemporaries, or those who preceded him. He's chosen to lead this expedition against the French at Fort Duquesne. Who was Edward Braddock, and why is he deemed, with that, even not having this experience on the actual battlefield, especially not in the climate or environment of North America, why is he deemed the right man for this job?
That's a great question. And I think the best way to answer it is to say that in my research, I kind of had to unlearn a lot of our inherited mythology about Braddock. And it really is that, it's mythology, caricature. I also had to think about some of the differences between how we in the 21st century think about military effectiveness versus how the British government, for example, thought about military effectiveness in a commander in that time period. So this is, I think, where Braddock's length of service is one of his key selling points. He's demonstrated proficiency and trustworthiness throughout his career. As an officer of the Coldstream Guards, he certainly has connections to the monarchy. He was entrusted with command, political and military authority at one of Britain's most important overseas posts, and that is Gibraltar. And so Braddock was not only the commander of the garrison there in 1753 into 54, he was also the lieutenant governor. So when Braddock is, and by all accounts, like, this was an area that I dug into deeply in my research, Braddock's tenure in Gibraltar, and by all accounts, he acquitted himself with just, again, great effectiveness. And so think about what he's being charged to do in America. He's first of all being made the commander-in-chief of all forces in North America. Technically, he's in charge of all four of those expeditions moving forward. He's also, as the commander-in-chief, invested with powers that politically that are kind of unprecedented. This is the first time in North American colonial history that a British commander-in-chief has been appointed with such immense influence and authority. So, I think that we have to look at his record as effective record as a commander, as the lieutenant governor at Gibraltar, as one of his key selling points. Can combat effectiveness help? Yes, but there are lots of commanders in military history that have been successful despite a lack of combat experience, like Dwight Eisenhower being one of them.
Yeah.
He missed World War I.
That's right. He was actually here in Gettysburg, where I currently am now, at the end of the war. But so I mentioned earlier that there are actual regular British troops being mobilized to sail to North America and partake in this offensive of 1755. Who are these regular troops, and some of the subordinate officers? Any key players you might like to mention that will follow Braddock to the colonies?
Okay, so yeah, this was a really fun aspect of the research, was diving into the backgrounds and the biographies of officers in Braddock's forces. So Braddock was charged with he was assigned two regular regiments, the 44th and the 48th regiments of foot, both of which were on garrison in Ireland in 1754. Let me just talk first about these two regular regiments. Here is where our mythology about, how often, whether we're talking about the French and Indian War or the Revolution, do we hear kind of people say, like pundits say, like, the British Army was the finest,
Mm-hmm.
army in the world, and like, no, it's not. And there's a great book, John Holding's book, on the peacetime British Army. He has a great phrase in that book called the friction of peace, in which he details how the British Army's effectiveness was eroded, degraded by this peacetime service, where they're out there, they're dispersed, they're garrisoning places like Ireland, and the 44th and the 48th regiments are case studies of this friction of peace. These were understrength units. They had to be supplemented even before Braddock left with drafts from other regiments. And drafts in that time period was kind of synonymous with the refuse of other regiments. So these units are kind of amalgams. They're further augmented by colonial recruits once they actually get to Virginia. So these units, they have a little bit of campaigning experience in the War of Austrian Succession. They have a little bit of experience in the response to the Jacobite Rising in 1745. And the question then became for me, how much of that experience translates? Like how many officers, for example, are still in the ranks of the 44th and the 48th in 1755, who are carrying this experience institutionally forward? And so I had to do a lot of research looking at the Army lists, figuring out that in fact there were very few officers, just given the turnover, transfers to other units, resignations. There were very few officers in these regiments that had this previous experience and that are still in the ranks in 1755. So all that to say, these two regiments that are seen as kind of the bulwarks of Braddock's strength in his expedition, they're very ineffective in the end, and they certainly have no background that can possibly prepare them for the type of warfare, for the type of environment that awaits them in Virginia and certainly in the Ohio Valley.
Mm-hmm. So augmenting, these regular troops who are partaking in Braddock's expedition are also colonial troops, not just with his force, but throughout those other three offensive as well. The majority of the colonies will actually send some kind of support to these various expeditions. So who are some of the colonial troops, or where they're from, that will join Braddock's army? And really, what is the relationship between the colonials and Braddock and the regulars alike at this time too?
So you're quite right. I mean, there are a number of colonies that do contribute support financially, militarily, logistically to Braddock's expedition. I have to separate that question in two ways. So there are technically other regular troops that are part of Braddock's expedition. I'm speaking here of two companies of the New York Independents, and then a detachment of the South Carolina Independent companies. And so these were technically British Army units. They're simply unregimented and therefore independent companies. But they were still classified as regulars. Over my shoulder here is a uniform regimental coat of the South Carolina Independents, with the kind of like Kermit the Frog looking facings and cuffs there, Popinjay green. So the New York and South Carolina Independents augment Braddock's army. And beyond that, there are a large number of Virginia provincial independent companies. There is a Maryland company and also a North Carolina company that joins Braddock's expedition. And in a nutshell, all these forces, they're coming from different places, and they eventually merge, and this army becomes one at Fort Cumberland in late May of 1755.
So probably one of the biggest flaws that history has remembered Braddock for is not having the Native American support that was probably required for him in this expedition. If you look at the Duke of Cumberland, the Captain General's orders to Braddock before he left North America, he made it clear in there that the Native American support is key, or you at least have to prevent them from joining with the French. So will Braddock have any Native American support as he moves forward from Fort Cumberland?
Yeah, so this was an area where I had to just think past the mythology. So one of the great myths that still is out there is this idea that Braddock spurned. He didn't just not look for it, but he actually spurned native support. And this was where the documents in front of me, some of them from Braddock's own hand, related the very sincere and earnest ways that this commander tried his best to solicit native support, even to the point of having William Johnson, who he met in Alexandria in April of 1755. Johnson pens some of the speeches that Braddock eventually delivers at Fort Cumberland in 1755. So I had to reject that. And instead, the explanation is really this reality that because of previous British expansion and notorious land deals, their support among native peoples is really at a nadir. There are just precious few native nations that see the British as their friends and allies. You also have to factor in the competition aspect. There was a hope that the Six Nations might be able to contribute warriors to these various expeditions, but again, the Six Nations really they were cautious overall, and as you know, there was a tug of war between William Johnson and William Shirley over native support for their expedition. So, in the end, Braddock had 8 Indian scouts. There was roughly about 24, I think, that were en route to Braddock's army when the battle happened. But all that to say, would native support have mattered in the end?
Right.
And this is where maybe you and I can talk about this interesting contrast between the Battle of Lake George and the Battle of the Monongahela. So on the one hand, people like to say, well, you know, if Braddock had had more Indians, this would never have happened. And certainly people did say that after the time of the disaster. On the other hand, William Johnson has a large contingent of natives, and they're on the morning of the bloody morning scout, they're in the lead.
Yeah. And unaware of the trap that it's laid ahead of them.
Right. So the irony here is that Johnson's force does have this large contingent of natives that's supposed to dispel disaster, but that's exactly the thing that befalls them anyways.
And on the opposite end there too, with the French at Lake George, the morning fight goes very well for the Baron de Dieskau as commander of the French forces. And once they approach William Johnson's camp and the main engagement begins, a lot of his Native American allies simply turn around and go home.
Right.
They're done with fighting. They head back to the battlefield of the morning to begin looking for plunder. And that's really it. So it is, especially this early in the war. I think the French do have, we'll get into this probably in the next question, but the French do have probably a better understanding of Native American relations and what to expect out of them, maybe in the Ohio River Valley more so than up in the north. Yeah, so that's a good transition. What about the French now at the forks of the Ohio? You know, what force do they possess there now? And is their relationship with the natives strong at this early stage in the conflict?
So the French relationship really is strong. As I mentioned before, British fortunes among native peoples in general here are it's at a nadir for the British, and the French have effectively in 1754 and into 1755 done a very effective outreach to their native allies, so much so that what ends up happening in the summer of 1755 is something new. It was at that point the largest coalition of native warriors that the French had ever assembled for an expedition. A better way to say that is that this was a kind of outgrowth of how willing native peoples were to support their French allies in this time of need. So I think from the natives' perspective, there is a kind of palpable sense that the British are the real threat. But in the end, French accounts say anywhere between 600 to 700 natives were present there at Fort Duquesne at the time of the battle.
Okay.
So the French have also overcome a lot of challenges in terms of logistics, just the same way that Braddock did. And so the real miracle in the 1755 campaign is timing. The French, it's kind of like all the stars come into alignment for the French and their native coalition partners. They assemble this force at exactly the right time in the end, in late June, early July 1755. The French did not have the ability to sustain this large of a force indefinitely. So the way to say this is that if General Braddock's force had arrived in, say, August of 1755 or September, there's no way that the French could have sustained that many mouths to feed.
Yeah.
But both Canadian and native. So here's where Braddock is unfortunate, in his earnest efforts to keep on schedule and to bring this train into the station. He arrives there in July of 1755 in the Ohio Valley, and that's exactly the perfect window of timing for the French and their native allies.
So now let's talk a little bit about Braddock's approach to the Monongahela. Where are the pieces of Braddock's force originally departing from, and where are they going to unite?
Okay, so I'll try to keep this quick. Braddock's force it eventually lands at Alexandria, and that's kind of where this whole thing kicks off. Braddock meets with several royal governors at the beautiful Carlisle House in Alexandria, which still stands. I encourage you to visit. Yeah. Anyone on this call, please visit the Carlisle House. It's a great site. And Braddock's force at that moment begins to confront the realities of North American campaigning. And it becomes a political challenge, an economic challenge, and especially a logistical challenge. So much so that Braddock has to divide his army. Part of his force advances through Maryland, and part of it advances northwest from Alexandria. And the reason for this division was logistical. There simply were not enough horses and to be able to sustain a single march through Virginia. Mm-hmm. These forces will eventually rendezvous, reunite at Fort Cumberland, same place as modern Cumberland, Maryland. And that fort is kind of like Braddock's base of operations, courtesy of Benjamin Franklin, who was commissioned to bring down horses and wagons and teamsters from Pennsylvania. The campaign can proceed. If it had not been for Franklin's horses and wagons and teamsters, Braddock's forces would have basically been stalled indefinitely at Fort Cumberland. Mm-hmm. From Fort Cumberland, it then becomes an incredible labor-intensive grind through the mountains as Braddock has to construct a military road capable of transporting wagons as well as his artillery.
So all in all, how long is that march from Alexandria to just outside of present-day Pittsburgh? Okay, so Braddock's road from Fort Cumberland to the field of battle, where they met the French and the Indians, it's about 115 miles. If Braddock had continued his march, it probably would have been around 125 miles to the point where they might have broken ground to besiege Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio. All right, well, let's bring him to that final leg of his journey west. It's July 9th, 1755. Let's bring on the battle. So, at this point, July 9th, Braddock has overcome every single obstacle that's been put in his place, whether it's perceived lack of political and economic support from the colonists. He's overcome this arduous, labor-intensive march across the Appalachian Mountains. And after Braddock has crossed the Monongahela twice, he's within, as I said earlier, about 10 miles of his destination. Aside from a few kind of jabs at his column from French and native scouting parties,
there's been no serious effort, no serious attempt to try to delay or halt Braddock's force. And so there's a palpable sense in the Army that they have overcome their obstacles. This is the home stretch. And there was also an expectation that if the French and the natives were to try to attack the British, that a river crossing while they're fording would be the most likely place. And so when they get across to that north bank of the Mon, British accounts fully relay this, that there was this sense of imminent victory. And Braddock was right on schedule. And so the French and their native coalition partners, they leave Fort Duquesne on the morning of the 9th. They understand as well that this is it. They have one chance to delay, halt, defeat, turn back Braddock's force. They know that he's coming with lots of artillery. They know that Fort Duquesne will not withstand any serious bombardment. And here again is where timing matters so much. The French and the native force strikes Braddock's column at for the British the worst possible moment, the worst moment psychologically in the sense that the British are they're so confident of victory. This is the least thing that they expect right now is a major battle on their hands. It's also the worst possible moment in terms of the topography and terrain, because Braddock's army is basically on the side of a ridge. They're climbing up this ridge along the contours, and it's again a terrible place in which to be caught in any type of battle, a long distended column. So back to that document that I discovered at the archive in Normandy. I'll talk through that briefly as a way to kind of get us through the battle.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Again, why the French win, why the French and the natives win, as opposed to why Braddock loses. First of all, let's look at the French officers. These are Canadians. They are not French army regulars fresh from Europe. And officers like Captain Beaujo and his subordinates, these are officers of deep experience militarily and diplomatically with the ways of North American warfare. This is by no means their first rodeo in a kind of, again, a coalition setting where they're dealing with, this is like a multinational force in a way. When you think about there are roughly about 20 different native nations represented here, along with the French Canadians. So it's interesting in this document to see, number one, some SOPs coming out, standard operating procedures. The French and the natives are advancing in 3 separate columns towards the British. Captain Beaujo sends out reconnaissance parties that inform him that the British have successfully crossed the river. There's no possibility of an ambush. And so the question then becomes, what is Beaujo going to do next? And so here is where Beaujo basically organizes what we call today a hasty ambush. this is not a set piece ambush like Lake George, where Braddock's force was essentially walking into a trap. This is more of an improvised attack, where the French, by plan, would strike the head of the British column first. Beaujo instructed via his French Canadian officers, who are embedded in these different native groups. He instructs the natives to fan out along the flanks and to withhold their fire until the French attack has proceeded against the head of the column. And here's where the Battle of the Monongahela gets really interesting. So in a sense, the British win this initial skirmish. The head of the British column actually stands its ground. They withstand this initial French attack, which ends up costing Captain Beaujo his life. He's killed by a shot through his body in some of these early volleys. It's at that point that this becomes truly a Native American victory in battle. The Native Americans there on the flanks unleash devastating volleys right into the flanks of the hapless British. The British soon begin to encounter a sound that they have never heard, the sound of hundreds of natives raising their war cries. It's a sound that psychologically defeats them just as much as bullets. From that point on, the natives are extending their reach along the British column. And the way that I put it in my book is that by the time General Braddock, who is kind of centered in the middle of the column at the head of the main body, by the time that he figures out what's happening at his front, in the vanguard of the column, natives are already making the rear of the column their target. So in the end, this is a battle of astonishing speed. And the British can never recover any type of initiative. And again, strung out nearly a mile in length, any effort they have to respond against the French and the native threat, it just creates further disorganization and chaos. So the best way to summarize the Battle of the Monongahela and its carnage, and again, it's shocking rapidity, is 2 out of every 3 British soldiers who crossed the Monongahela on July 9th are killed or wounded in the space of 4 hours.
It is astonishing. It really is. Like, disaster is not an over-exaggeration describing it for Braddock. And Braddock himself obviously is mortally wounded in the fighting. He will not die right away, though. Correct.
Yeah,
he will
he does survive a few days. He dies on July 13th, 1755. His remains are still there. If you visit Fort Necessity National Battlefield, you can visit one of their units there called the Braddock's Grave Unit.
And is there anything of the Monongahela battlefield really left today? If people want to go out there and visit the site, what can they expect to see? Are there any museums or other facilities nearby that they can visit?
So there's actually quite a bit that remains, and I'll mention just two things. In my book, one of the appendices has a list of different historical sites pertaining to Braddock's campaign that one can visit. The site of the battlefield today I encourage anybody who's interested to go to the town of Braddock and also the borough of North Braddock. And there is a museum called the Braddock's Battlefield History Center. I'm actually on the board of directors, full disclosure. But it's a wonderful museum that sits at the exact point where the French and the British columns exchanged fire on July 9th, 1755. And even though the much of the battlefield was given over to industrial and urban uses in the 19th and 20th centuries, one can still clearly perceive a lot of the terrain features that were there at the battle. So again, check out Braddock's Battlefield History Center, just a few miles outside of the city of Pittsburgh.
All right, so to wrap this up tonight, I have one more question, and obviously it's to provide the tail end of the context of this battle. What were the immediate consequences of Braddock's defeat, and were there any far-reaching ones that extended well beyond 1755?
Yeah, that's the question. You know, Benjamin Franklin famously said in his testimony to the British Parliament in 1766, this was during the Stamp Act crisis, he said that Braddock's defeat gave the colonists the first inkling that the regulars were not invincible, and I think there's something to that. It was a shocking disaster, and it really roiled the British world, partly because victory was so expected, and partly this sense that this professional, regular British Army force was defeated by irregulars. Mm-hmm. And that's not supposed to happen in the 18th century. So one of the immediate consequences of Braddock's defeat is that it just swings the strategic momentum all the way over to the French and their native allies. The French not only capture Braddock's artillery train, they capture his headquarters papers, which is just filled with all sorts of damning correspondence. Again, this is a battle that occurs in a time of peace. I would say even more important is the material that native warriors are taking with them back to their homes and communities. For the natives, this was a resounding victory that inspired them to support the French again in future fights. This checked the boxes for native warriors in so many ways. Clear evidence of a devastating victory. They take horses, they take British officers' coats, equipment, all this stuff that they had gotten from Braddock's wagon trains, scalps. Weren't many captives taken. There were a few, but this is a battle that had to have been the talk of a lot of campfires in native towns and communities, and it explains why there was this kind of outpouring of native support for the French in 1756 and 57. For the British, Braddock's defeat really changes their strategic goals in North America. So just to review here, we've seen in our discussion, this whole thing started because of some territorial disputes and some French forts built in these contested territories. the shocking nature of Braddock's defeat means that the British want to make the destruction of Canada the goal in this conflict. British politicians use the famous line from, I think it's Cato the Elder, where he said in the Roman Senate, Carthage must be destroyed. And so now the British are saying that Canada must be destroyed. And this Braddock's defeat is one of the reasons that that impels the British to this more totalizing objective, not just control of the Ohio Valley, but the destruction of French power in North America. And that, in a nutshell, is what sets the British, the colonists, indeed the continent, on that road to revolution, just a short 2 decades in the future.
And two, look at the civilians who are living out on the frontiers of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Braddock's defeat really opens up all of that territory to French and Native American raids, which those civilians are going to face the ravages of for the next 3+ years before Fort Duquesne and most of the Ohio River Valley is finally subdued and captured.
Yeah, that's a great point too. You know, Braddock's Road, it functions in that way as a highway in reverse for the French and the Indians. But it's important to emphasize that Braddock's expedition was really the first time that the British have attempted to project military force deep into the continent. And Braddock's Road is hugely important in the post-war years in allowing settlers from Pennsylvania and Maryland, Virginia, to get easy access into the Ohio Valley. Braddock's Road, in a sense, became his victory.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So the fighting that takes place, is tragic for Braddock, but his march to the Monongahela River, it really is one of the most impressive feats for the Anglo side of colonial history, in honestly the history of warfare in all of North America, and despite how it really did conclude. So it does need to receive its praise too, as well as its criticism. So David, I really want to thank you tonight for being part of our Rev War Revelry Zoom. This was a really enlightening and interesting and enjoyable discussion, and I hope a lot of our visitors who did tune in, they were either, if this is their introduction to the Battle of Monongahela, if they are seasoned veterans in it, I hope that maybe their eyes have been opened to some of the myths that have transpired and existed about this battle for 200+ years. And I do want to thank everyone for tuning in. You can join us for our next revelry. It will be on September 18th, and we're going to have a discussion about the Battle of North Point during the War of 1812 and 1814. So jumping from the French and Indian War, one side of the Revolution, all the way to the other side of the War of 1812 now. And we still do have 2 major events coming up for the rest of the year. On September 24th, we will be having our symposium in Alexandria. Tickets are still available for that to sign up. And then in November 11th through 13th, we'll be having our bus tour that will cover Valley Forge and the Monmouth campaign. Several tickets are still available for that. So please, if you are interested, sign up. That can be done on our Facebook page or our website, www.emergingrevolutionarywar.org. And before we sign off, I would also like to give David a chance here to promote another seminar that will be taking place in November, just the week before of our bus tour out near Jumonville.
Right. So there's a really wonderful French and Indian War seminar that happens each year. It's always the first weekend in November, and it's called the Jumonville Seminar of the French and Indian War. If you look up the Braddock Road Preservation Association, you can find out more about the seminar and how to register for it. Similar to what Emerging Revolutionary War does, we also have a bus tour the first day of that seminar, and we'll be exploring a lot of the terrain that we've talked about in this book, sites like Fort Necessity and the Braddock's Battlefield History Center and a few other places in between. So anyone interested in the French and Indian War, please consider coming out and joining the Braddock Road Preservation Association.
And thank you again, David, for joining us tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us to listen. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Labor Day weekend. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.